Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sue Burgess. I'm the Director of Public Programs here at the Shrine. The Shrine is held in care by the Shrine Trustees on behalf of all Victorians. We acknowledge the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional custodians of the land on which the Shrine stands, and pay our respects to their elders past and present. As a place of remembrance and storytelling, we honour their deep connection to country and waterways, shaped by generations of stories and memories. And I'd also like to recognise the traditional owners of the countries where you're all joining us from today. And to past and present members of the Australian Defence Forces who are joining us, welcome. Thank you all for joining us today for this talk on War Animals Remembrance Day. I'll hand over to Nigel shortly, but just a bit of housekeeping first. If you have a question, please put it in the chat function and we'll collate these questions and hopefully get Nigel to answer as many as possible at the end. And please make sure your microphone is on mute so we don't get any background noise during the webinar. And also note the session is being recorded and will be sent to you in the coming days. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker for today, Nigel Allsopp. Nigel is regarded as one of the world's leading service animal subject matter experts and has published several non-fiction books on this subject. He has spent over 40 years working professionally with animals, including as a military dog handler, police dog handler, zookeeper, wildlife ranger, and animal shelter supervisor. Nigel is also the president of the Australian War Animals Memorial Organisation, which is a not-for-profit that raises awareness around the deeds and sacrifices of all animal species who have given their lives and their loyalty serving alongside their human comrades. Please join me in welcoming Nigel, and thank you for joining us.
Hi, Sue. Thank you very much. I guess I know, Sue, that sort of pigeons is going to be a big focus today, as requested by the Shrine. But if I could start off, Sue, with a generalisation of war animals, I guess here in Australia and indeed in New Zealand, Anzac animals. 9 million animals died collectively for Allied forces in the First World War. Thankfully, we honoured those just in 2017 by opening up at Pozieres on the Western Front, the Australia, New Zealand, and the rest of the world's official war animal memorial to honour them. So lots of animals were involved, obviously, in war. We all see movies like War Horse, and we think, for a start, that it's mainly horses, and even in that equine area, we see quite often the charge of cavalry horses, or in the case of Australia and New Zealand, mounted infantry that usually dismount, apart from the famous charge of Bathsheba. But it was the heavy horses that towed all the luggage, the logistics, the artillery, the G-wagons that supplied everything from toilet rolls to bullets, and a lot of unsung heroes are basically mules and donkeys that were the backbone for logistics. And of course, one of the subjects today is messenger pigeons, and they've been with us indirectly since World War One. They became quite eminent again in World War II. Australia had about 25,000 deployed in the Southwest Pacific area. So I don't know, Sue, if there's any sort of questions that you had in mind to start with, or you'd like me just to continue generally?
I think just keep going, Nigel. I think the pigeons is going to be really interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, I think Laura's got something up on my screen anyway, a PowerPoint which I think she's going to operate in a moment. There's various slides on it with some pictures. But in regard to pigeons, of course, I'm in Canberra at the moment. We were just delivering Australia's very first distinctive animal award, service award, which has just gone to Manik, a commando dog, for his service in Iraq and with coalition forces. An Australian dog. He also worked in Australia, and coincidentally, at the same time, if there's any New Zealanders listening, I believe we had a couple on the list in Waiyuru at the National Army Museum. At the same time, today they also presented two New Zealand Afghan veteran dogs with the same distinguished service award. So that's the first for both countries, and we hope to issue that award to animals. Um, Not just dogs, of course. That's the one that we sort of seem to focus on in recent times, with seeing specialist dogs, explosive detection dogs in Afghanistan and Iraq. But every animal is obviously open to those awards.
It's fantastic.
Now, in
Thank you.
regard Yeah, so in regard to pigeons, obviously in Australia, it was the Australian or the AIF as opposed to the ADF. We were part of the Imperial Forces, um, and same with New Zealand. They were New Zealand Expeditionary Forces. So both countries actually fought for want of a better word, or alongside the British Army. So a lot of our soldiers that were pigeon fanciers and experts in those fields tend to be seconded to the Corps of Signals or the engineers under those commands, as opposed to our own individual Australian Defence Force pigeons, as we might call them today. The pigeons really are the unsung hero. In World War One, a lot of us think, well, fairly modern technology, but the reality was of the Western Front, um, cables or wires going from the front to the rear echelon, where the commanders were quite frequently bombed and broke. Um, they had to use runners, human beings. One of the perhaps most notorious runners on the German side was Adolf Hitler, Corporal Adolf Hitler. But obviously, Australia and New Zealand in particular used runners. We also used messenger dogs to some quite success. But pigeons by far were some of the most reliable sources of communication in World War One. The enemy also had a habit of tapping into our hard-wired telephone cables and listening in. So again, homing pigeons were ideal to counter that, a role that they would again experience in World War Two, when the Japanese broke our Australian codes, and this is where we start to use a lot more pigeons in Kokoda and Papua New Guinea and the Southwest Pacific in particular. So, they were a very reliable source. Um, some of some of them have received the highest animal honours, the Dickens Medal, the equivalent to the Victoria Cross of animals. In fact, more pigeons have won it than any other animal. And if anyone would like to know some details about some specifics about how certain birds won them and the distances they flew, I can do that. Um, the thing with pigeons, they actually are about the second fastest flying bird in the world. Incredibly, they can fly at about 90 kilometers an hour. I use the word second because the Germans used to use peregrine falcons to actually attack them to try and stop messages going through. There was a German in particular, uh, falcon or eagle regiment that was stationed on the British coast that would try and intercept messenger pigeons heading back to the UK. So again, I guess Laura will go down a couple of more slides if we can, and if that's possible, um, and talk about them. Has anyone got any particular questions they might like to ask thus far? So you can see in this photo that in front of you, two New Zealanders with pigeons. You can see how desolate it is. Obviously, the enemy in this case tried to shoot. They even employed specialist marksmen with specialist weapons to try and shoot the pigeons. Um, that's how reliable and useful they were. In the United Kingdom, there was actually a fine of £5, quite a large sum of money, if anyone sort of killed a pigeon, a military pigeon. And these pigeons had to operate in all conditions, like you see in the photograph, in the wet, the noise of artillery, but also chemical weapons such as gassing. They did an amazing sort of role. There's one famous pigeon, a Sherami, which wasn't one of our pigeons, but it's probably one of the most um, pigeons, famous pigeons. That was reportedly sent to um, back to headquarters. It was wounded on the way by shrapnel, wounded a second time by its wing was severed, and it was blinded in one eye, gassed by gas. Yet, I won't go into the arguments of cognizant thought or sentient beings, but this animal, let's say, had the training or the nous or the cognizant thought um, to actually walk the rest of the way um, back to the headquarters and deliver the message. Quite amazing, really. I see, Laura, there was a couple of questions there as I was talking. I think I missed them. I don't know if they can be brought
We
back up
might.
again. I think one question was how many pigeons in World War One were used by Australian forces. The honest truth is, I actually don't have a number, nor do the Australian War Memorial, and nor do the Australian Pigeon Association, Fanciers Association, which I asked. It's because we worked basically under the British, and we basically used their pigeons as opposed to World War Two. Um, um, that we supplied most of our pigeons from Australia. When they got there, we used over 25,000. A lot of them, if they weren't from Queensland, were very susceptible if they were born in other places such as Melbourne to the harsh climates in the PNG and the Southwest Pacific, and a lot of them came down with heat-related diseases. So they actually bred them in their own coops in situ up there, and they were found to be better birds, able to deliver the messages. So around about 25,000 during World War II, starting in 1942. Um, uh, the Pigeon Corps was part of the Signals Corps. It was actually initially called the Signals Pigeon Corps. Um, the Defence Force recruited pigeon fanciers as a priority, but they did have some people that were trained from scratch. But idyllically, I'm told they weren't the best of handlers. They preferred pigeon fanciers and then converted them, made them soldiers. It was an easier process. And most of the pigeons in Southwest Pacific were operated from not only land, uh, flying through the canopies of the jungles, but also they were utilised on Australian ships that were around the coast, and they basically the ships went out to sea. They'd have a couple of pigeons on. If they got into trouble, they would literally send the pigeons back, um, and they would get back in record time. One little example is and they have unfortunately the pigeons like blue cock and a certain number. Unfortunately, they we'd like to see. I think there's a move to try and sort of go back in history and give some of these amazing animals names. But one particular pigeon was on board a ship that had ammunition and Australian soldiers on it. It came aground. It was sinking, and a pigeon made an amazing fly back to headquarters, which was something like 45 kilometers away in round about 50 minutes, which is considering the conditions of the weather at the time that caused the boat to crash on rocks. It's quite amazing, and these people were rescued. And they also Australian pigeons worked for Americans. I see a question just came in about where I think I may have partially answered it. They were initially recruited in Australia, the pigeons, and many of them work successfully, but they found it better to take younger pigeons and breed them in situ in places like PNG and the Solomon Islands, and actually use in basically bred pigeons to operate there. So I think there was a couple of other questions that came up. I'll have to try and look at them again, Laura, if I can. If they can come up, I'm not sure. So yeah, if we got another PowerPoint there, to refresh my memory, I can't remember what the next one was, to be honest. But I guess while we're waiting, in relation to the other animals that have served, as well as pigeons, obviously, currently military working dogs are the biggest animal user. Um, and yep, I'll just stop there because I'm reading a message. Were pigeons used in planes as well as ships? Yes. Australian and New Zealand bow fighters in particular, flying across the channel. The In particular, had pigeons on board. They were used in two ways. One, if the plane crashed, they would be released in the crash site. But they also, with some irony, even though they could fly, they were wrapped up in such a way they couldn't fly, and they were thrown out of a plane with a parachute on, and they would descend to troops. Particularly, the RAF would send pigeons to the French resistance, who then could put messages on, and then they would fly back to their coops in the United Kingdom. So yeah, even though they could fly, sometimes they were dispatched by parachute, which is a bit ironic. The picture that you can see up at the moment is of the light horse in the Sinai campaign. Again, there was a pigeon section that the Australians used as part of the light horse troop to get messages back and forward.
Nigel, I was hoping you could speak a little bit about how pigeons were trained and that process during wartime.
Sure. Look, they are obviously homing pigeons, so they need to be bred and fed, um, and um, and housed. I'll just get rid of this, unfortunately. Um, um, uh, and housed um, in a particular location. It's, let's just call it their home, and then they are taken out, a few kilometers at a time, and they used to being fed there, for example. Um, uh, and they learn to fly back over greater distances, etc., etc. You just can't take a pigeon, even with mobile lofts that we're used to. You just can't sort of expect it to fly from point A to point B if it's never been there before. It will always fly back to its roost or its home, from wherever you release it or dispatch it. The average distance got up to, there was regulations in the Australian Defence Force that they weren't allowed to fly, or not supposed to fly, more than 60 miles. That's about 100 kilometres as far as distance was concerned. And so that training process, as I've just explained, is one of constant sort of expanding the distance. Obviously, they're rewarded by food when they get back, which is most of their stimuli. Um, One of the most difficult questions to answer, and I don't think scientifically we still know 100%, is the fact that how they work this out, flying over terrain and in day and night and things like that. It's still a bit of a mystery to a lot of people, and even though the French army to this day operate messenger pigeons, and they have them as a reserve in a time of technology. If there was some form of nuclear sort of strike where it rendered all our mobile phones and computers inoperative, pigeons, believe it or not, will come back to their fore. They'll be the only way we can communicate.
Wonderful. Would you
And
like
I
me
guess,
to
yeah,
move on to the next slide?
yeah, go ahead. Uh, yep, it's still the old one. We've got another one coming up. I think it's one below the one that's on there now. I've talked about that one. That's a light horse one. There's a one below that, Laura, at all? Um, I
Next one
haven't got it
again.
up yet. Yeah, is there another one? Yeah, yeah, we've talked about that one. Yeah, this is what I was talking about, a mobile loft. you know, um, they would be trained to come back to that. The no mobile lofts, moved. They were obviously in the rear echelons. They could also be used in the front lines, and pigeons would fly back, say, to the UK. In that case, you can see one of them being dispatched out of a tank on the bottom left. Um, the top one was a motorcycle detachment. Um, the the one picture we've got up now is the leg of a pigeon, as you can see, and that particular message that's on the right hand side was obviously curled up and put in the little tube container. Now, the one thing I must add is, like, I guess in today's society, we're used to the mobile phone. So, imagine in World War One and even World War Two, how would you get a map of a particular area you wanted to attack or advance back to headquarters? Um, well, you couldn't do it on a wire, you couldn't do it on Morse code. So the only way was to draw a map on a piece of silk paper and literally fold it up and put it in a pigeon and get it to back to headquarters via dispatch. Quite often, the Australian Defence Force dispatched a pigeon and a messenger dog at the same time, hoping that at least one of them would get back. Yeah. So, any more questions? I don't know if we've got any more slides we can go down to as well after this one.
Nigel, I think you might be seeing some different slides to to what we are. So I'm just
Okay.
moving back and forth with them. But maybe you could speak about some of the pigeons that won awards during the war.
Yeah, look, there were two Australian pigeons which just have serial numbers on. Where, along with the Pigeon Society, we're trying to get them names, but associated instead of a horrible number. But the I've already explained one of them travelled for many miles. Another one was on loan to the American forces. It had a Australian pigeon handler attached to the American forces in the jungles of PNG, and what they got ambushed by Japanese. And bear in mind, there's very low canopy in the jungle, and so the pigeons have quite an effort to sort of penetrate that jungle canopy, and they couldn't get messages back for reinforcements, and so two pigeons were dispatched. One, the Japanese shot out of the sky. The other one managed to get back to the headquarters some 30 miles away in a record time of about 30 minutes. Remembering how fast these pigeons can literally fly, and reinforcements were sent, and that American platoon were able to be rescued and saved. So, yeah, that is, and as someone asked previously before, yes, they were used in planes, they were used in tanks in World War One, they were certainly used in planes in World War Two, they were used in Queensland, they were used a lot even as far as Perth for coastal defence. Our coastal watchers used them, and Queensland pigeons were deemed to be the best because of I guess, their exposure to heat and those tropical diseases. The other thing that they had to do, stop doing from Australia, was supplying local rations from Australia. They used to get mold and weevil by the time they got up to the jungles in heat. So they had specially sealed containers of pigeon food, and the handlers would make up, a mixture of the correct cereal for them, and birdseed, etc., in situ when they're up in those tropical locations.
And we've got a slide on the screen here that has captured German war pigeons and what I'm
Yeah.
assuming is a falcon.
Yeah, look, the falcon, it's just represents, birds were used to track down pigeons from the forces. British and Germans likewise used falcons to literally stop the messages going through. The bottom one is of American unit that captured war pigeons. There's a funny story that's actually associated with that. There was an article about that particular pigeon that was captured, and it was helping the American Armed Forces produce more American war pigeons. So its sexual prowess was used to breed more American pigeons after the German pigeons. So he contributed to the Allied side quite substantially, siring several hundred American pigeons after his capture. Good story. Yeah. So, yeah, has anyone else got any questions they want to type up there? Messenger dogs, as I explained before, Adolf Hitler, as you can see, has got his pet dog. He was a messenger. That's on the lower right image that I'm looking at anyway. And messenger dogs, again, used. This case, it's a picture of a Royal Engineer from the British Army, but Australia certainly used messenger dogs. In fact, similar to the last story, there was a dog called Roff, Roff, which was a German messenger dog, but I suppose the joke was he got sick of eating sausages and uh, sort of defected to the Australian troops in World War One, and he was used extensively by Australian troops instead. And they kept him all the way to the end of the war, and they tried to repatriate him back to Australia. Um, Technically, he made it, but he actually died on the way, and his body is occasionally on display at the Australian War Museum. He's actually stuffed, literally, and is in a display case. So yeah, a great asset dogs were, and they used messenger dogs, Australia in World War II as well. One dog called Sandy was used in PNG as well as a messenger dog. The good thing about the dogs, they can be utilized for other roles as well, such as early warning for gas attacks, casualty rescue dogs. How they would work, there was one very famous dog called Digger in World War One, and he started off as a mascot. He served in Anzac Cove, was wounded a couple of times. Him and his handler survived Anzac Cove and went to the Western Front. And he was wounded. He went over the top 16 times. He was shot in the jaw and repatriated back to Australia. But the not legally. His handler had to smuggle him back. And unfortunately, a few years later, he was listening by the bed of the serviceman, his handler, who had what we now call PTSD. And Federation happened. He heard some fireworks go off, thought the war was back on, jumped over a fence to warn his handler. Unfortunately, he spared himself and he died in his handler's arms. And his collar is again mounted in a museum to honour him. So he's a very famous dog in Australia.
Nigel, can I jump in? We've got a question from Mike.
Yep.
My grandfather once told me that during World War II, there were pigeon lofts down the Queensland coast from PNG to Brisbane and Macarthur, so comms could always be maintained.
Yep, that's correct. I thought I'd just actually mentioned that before. And they used them in other parts of Australia, particularly for coastal watches as well. Toowoomba had a big a loft where they bred a lot of, pigeons as well. But ultimately, most of them served in in PNG and the Southwest Pacific. But they were certainly used in homeland defence, as we would call it today, as messengers. Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if you can see it here. I've actually got a duplicate of one of the Dickens medal, the PTSD medals that was awarded to Australian pigeons, of the two of them. Just a duplicate in my hand. Hopefully everyone can see that. I'm sure they won't actually put it around the pigeon's neck, but it's obviously an award for the pigeon.
We've got another
Sorry,
question
Sue.
here,
Yeah.
Nigel. What was the survival rate of pigeons that were used for this work? And what happened to those pigeons that survived after the war?
Yeah, look, the exact numbers of repatriation aren't available. No one seems to know. We used over 25,000, and it's believed up to 60% of them died in situ. So at best, perhaps only 40% of them could have perhaps returned as well. But unfortunately, Australia had a very rigid quarantine requirements during World War One and World War Two. In fact, it wasn't until 1993 in Mogadishu, Somalia, that the first animals in Australia were basically legally allowed to come back. A war horse Sandy was brought back in World War One. Other animals were sometimes smuggled back. I'm sure lots came back in the suitcases, and there's an unknown number of pigeon fanciers, which I would certainly suggest would have tried to smuggle the pigeons back. But there's no official army records that state how many actually were returned. Sadly, I think there wouldn't have been many at all.
And so a follow-up question then, what happened to the pigeons that were captured? Were they just then used by the people that captured them? What would have happened to them?
Probably lunch, but the you know, it would be difficult to sort of trust a pigeon if it, because their homing instinct would be so strong. Let's just say one got captured by the Japanese, they would have obviously used the information for intelligence that was on its leg. But if they let it go, it was more than likely would have flown back, to its coop, and they were an asset. So I would suggest that some may have been consumed, or just killed. Yeah. You know, it happens, unfortunately, in war, that they become a vital asset. It's like mules in particular were deliberately targeted in World War One and World War Two. In fact, German U-boats in World War One used to deliberately target ships that were carrying mules. Such was their known value. It's a way of, eroding a combatant's capabilities.
Another question here, Nigel, from Tracy. Hi, I always led to believe that homing pigeons always returned to the loft where they were born, which has always confused me as to how they could be used in different places and areas during the war. I guess that's probably an expansion on the way they were trained.
I think she's right, and I've answered sort of part of that already. They were bred up in situ, they were trained in the particular lofts, and they would fly back to those lofts. Those mobile lofts tended to be one way. They couldn't go from one loft to another if they didn't know that. They couldn't be used like that. They're basically a one direction thing. They couldn't return, back. They would have a separate lot of pigeons trained up at the other end that flew the other way to a particular loft, or a particular headquarters. They're basically used as a one-way system. Dogs were different, of course, because dogs were trained with two messenger dogs were deliberately trained with two handlers. And so one handler would always feed the dog and the other handler wouldn't. And so the handler that didn't feed it went to the front with the dog. The handler that fed it and the dog was used to would track back the way it came would be the person that it had the best rapport and the food was available, and the dogs used to run back to them to get fed. Repetition through association. That's how you train any animal. If you can see the bottom picture, I used to actually train elephants at some stage of my life. I spent about 4 or 5 years in the zoo industry, and the training for most animals is exactly the same. Repetition through association with the right commands and usually food stimuli. So hopefully that answers her question.
I think so.
So she's certainly on the right track, yes.
To your knowledge, Nigel, has there been other attempts to use other bird species for this sort of work? I know you mentioned the German peregrine falcon. Have Australian or American, British forces ever attempted to use different types of birds for this similar sort of work?
Yes and no. Yes, they've used similar birds, but not for messenger delivery that I am aware of. For example, the Anzac mining troops use canaries, very similar to civilian canaries. In the day, canaries were taken down, and literally because of the bad air, etc., carbon monoxide, they were in little cages, and if they fell off the cage, they were very sensitive with the amount of oxygen in tunnels. Once they fell off the cage, it was time for the soldiers to go back out. The next one was in Kuwait. that I'm aware of, that the American Marines experimented with chickens. I do apologize for this sounding like a little bit of a joke, but sadly, it is a true story. Um, they they took chickens for the possibility of detecting chemical warfare. The idea being that if the chickens were affected, like if they passed away, then the men would put their mask on, gas attack. Um, the reason I said it sounded a little funny, which I didn't mean to make light of the animal, but the animals were the Kurati field chickens, KFC. I don't know if someone had a sense of humor when they named them, but they were known as the KFC chickens in the first Gulf War.
Another question here, Nigel. So you mentioned that pigeons were still used in France today. Are they
Yeah.
still used in other countries, and do you think they should be?
I believe China may also have a pigeon corps. Switzerland stopped using them in 1998, and there was a rumor that they were going to restart them again. Certainly, Australia doesn't. And yeah, look, I don't think it would do any harm to fortunately, there are pigeon fanciers out there that continue the tradition and racing pigeon association. So I think if Australia probably doesn't need to have any in the military today, but we could draw on the expertise, just like they did in World War One and World War Two, with people that are currently pigeon fanciers and handlers. I think there is still knowledge out there that if they were needed at some stage due to a catastrophic breakdown of communications, I'm sure they could be re-established fairly fast if needed.
So it's war
But
animal. Sorry, go on.
yeah, sorry, I just thought I didn't miss an important um, bird to your previous question, was of course certainly not or underrated completely, and that's a lot of soldiers had birds, particularly in the Navy and the trenches, as simply as pets, um, and the uh, for morale and to provide good mental health and a bit of homeland, bit of comfort. So certainly birds have been used, for that particular role, which I think is underrated. I just saw, by the way, Sue, a question pop up. It was established, the Signal Corps, in 42, and I believe the final ones were disbanded in 90, just after the war in 46. It may have lingered on some people up as much as 48, when the Veterinary Corps was disbanded as well at that time.
And there's another one popped up too, Nigel. Were the pigeon handlers mostly fanciers in civilian life, or were they trained up during wartime, given the number that was required?
Again, both answers are correct. Initially, fanciers. I've been told by many sources that from even sons of deceased handlers now, since we're getting on in time, um, you know, uh, they absolutely tried to use pigeon fanciers first because they knew the birds. It was easier to train a pigeon fancier to become a soldier than the other way around. Alas, because of the number of requirements, indeed they did train some people, but they found they were a lower standard, and birds' efficiency and effectiveness was affected. So the much preferred option was to use experts in the field, pigeon fanciers.
Excellent. So Laura and I are coming up with some other questions as well, but I think we've got one. How long did it take to train a pigeon up after birth to being used to deliver a message?
I'd have to honestly say um, um, I don't know. I've actually never trained a pigeon myself to deliver a message. According to AWM statistics, most of the birds that were bred there could be operational after the second fledgling, and used ideally when they're about 18 months old, a year to 18 months old. And I don't know, to be honest, their longevity, how long they use them for, how many years. But like I said, they certainly used the pigeons from 42 right till the end of the war.
So, are you aware of any monuments to pigeon service around the world, Nigel?
Yes, absolutely. Australia, in fact, my charity, AWAMO, um, uh, a bronze plaque was put in at the Heritage Centre in Queensland, and it was recorded. It's been recorded as the world's first war animal pigeon. About 3 years ago, the Australian War Museum in Canberra has a beautiful large plaque, bronze plaque in the ground with a pigeon, a three-dimensional pigeon on it, honouring the pigeons of World War II. I
Fantastic.
also believe, yeah, I also believe in France, there's a memorial, a stone engraving of a pigeon, a war pigeon, that the French army has installed.
And I believe that the new Anzac station is going to have some images and um, acknowledgement of pigeons as well when that opens later this year.
Yeah, I believe so. That'll be amazing. Like I say,
Mm.
they really are. Um, I call pigeons and mules, in respectively, as the the workhorses, but the forgotten heroes of the war. I mean, let's face it. Sadly, today, some people refer to pigeons as rats with wings. Because you sometimes see them, in their thousands, and say, Trafalgar Square in London, just to name one you know, and people think of them as a pest, but they were a huge asset to the war asset. It's a pity a lot of people that shoo them off and think they're annoying. They'd be quite surprised to hear how brave and the deeds and sacrifices that pigeons made in a couple of wars for this country.
So, Nigel, sort of we've been zeroing in on pigeons a bit this afternoon, but just sort
Yeah,
of stepping back out of that,
sure.
why do you think that War Animal Remembrance Day is an important day for us to reflect?
Yeah, look, a Purple Poppy Day, War and Service Animal Day, it's just shows, I guess, the human side to remember that it wasn't just two-legged diggers, but four-legged or winged diggers, and served this nation. Thousands, if not millions, of animals died during the wars. More horses died in World War II than in World War One. The alleged, mechanized war. 5.5 million horses alone were used by the German armed forces. And it's unknown, but it's believed to be double that by the Russian forces. So it's really important. I think Mahatma Gandhi had a great saying: "You can judge a nation by the way it treats its animals." And I think today, because animals tend to be more regarded as pets than perhaps workhorses. Like in World War One, the horse was the bus, the milk cart, the truck, the ute of its day, towing something. Now, I believe people are more open-minded. They're more empathetic towards animals. I don't know many people that have a dog that don't regard the dog as their, a furry member of the family, for example. Cats as well, of course. And so I think, certainly this generation, I think, are more open to acknowledging that animals have served and sacrificed. And look, one of our most famous, I guess, historic battles was the Charge of Beersheba. Well, imagine that without animals. It would be the brisk walk to Beersheba, wouldn't it? Our history, particularly the light horse, is based on animals. Our country was initially sort of in the agricultural community anyway, founded by the use of sheep, dogs, and horses. We couldn't have farmed this nation as we did in early settlement times without animals. And today animals are doing an amazing job in assistance dogs for veterans, post-traumatic stress. We know about guide dogs and seeing eye dogs and dogs that can detect illnesses and ranging from COVID to cancer. So, they are still very much a part of our community. And I'd personally like to see a lot more shops put up signs, saying service dogs welcome, um, to their establishments. I think it's very important that we honour them.
Absolutely. We've got a few minutes left, so Nigel's available, and he's incredibly knowledgeable. So, do we have any more questions coming through? Doesn't look like it. Nigel, did you want to make some sort of final observations, perhaps about pigeons and how important they've been?
Yeah, look, again, because the Japanese broke our codes in the Southwest Pacific, the only way to get information back, intelligence and secret information, was by the use of either human runners, which was, very deadly for them as well, or pigeons, and particularly from ships to shore, and it's you know, as I said before, I think they made a marvelous role in helping our troops survive in places like Kokoda. You know, um, they're an asset I think we couldn't have done. So they're very important. And even today, military working dogs are obviously at the forefront of people's knowledge, and uh, you can see military working dogs have worked in Afghanistan, etc., in Iraq, and in homeland defence. I mean, it's war and service animals. The police service, for example, have explosive detection dogs, police dogs that track down criminals, police dogs that find your missing children in the bush. So animals are working for us still, and there is obviously a move to try and establish, particularly in this current world of drone warfare, to incorporate drone dogs. And look, one day, I'd actually personally love to see our animals not going to war and be replaced by a four-legged drone. That would be marvelous, and they are on the drawing boards and they do test them. The problem is at the moment, a lot of Australian service dogs get what we call a second chance. And so rather than breed the animals and the dogs themselves, they get them from the pound, dogs that were going to be euthanized. And so they get those, and hence the word second chance animals. And I think that's a great thing. And no one wants to see their pet go to war, just like we don't want to see our children go to war. But they've got an ability which helps bring back Australians alive, two-legged soldiers. That's why we still utilize them. The other reason we don't use mechanical expertise at the moment or drone dogs is, as I said, you can get Manic, who got the award today, cost $8. A drone of a similar capability is probably more about $10 million worth of technology. So you can see it's going to be a while yet until they're replaced, in the field. But let's hope one day that they are. And let's hope we don't have to use those pigeons ever again in war. That would be lovely,
Now, we've had a couple of questions coming in while you were talking. The first one from Mike: how many Aussie pigeoneers were recruited in World War I to handle British pigeons in Europe?
The honest answer I've got for you is I don't know. I couldn't find any records anywhere about the exact numbers. They did operate in World War II. I could give you a number. They operated under three lofts, each of about 35 staff per loft in operational capacity, and there were up about 2,000 people training and breeding and all that type of stuff there and in Australia. But because our Australian or Anzac troops were literally pinched by the Imperial British forces to be used, if they knew they were pigeon fanciers, there were like temporary assignments. They came from a multiple corps. But all I can tell you, there were certain troops, like in the Sinai, there was the second signal troop. So, a troop is usually about 15 men. They wouldn't have needed many more men than that to operate. So hopefully that answers your question, but I have to be honest and say I certainly couldn't find a number. And let me know if you know the number yourself. That would be a great bit of history and information.
And one last question, I think, from Tracy. You mentioned about the Japanese breaking the codes. When did that happen?
well, a pride of 42, hence why the army decided to use pigeons they started about July, and the first one was operational in October, and 42 when they were first deployed. They were brought together because of that very reason. The Japanese pride of 42 were breaking into our code, so they decided, well, let's use pigeons to type and counter that. I can't give you, it's not like I know it was Wednesday, the 28th of August. I don't know an exact day, but it was prior to 1940, July 1942, that they must have done it. Hence why they decided to use them for that very reason.
Great, thank you, Nigel. Okay, and Tracy's added, during World War I, my grandfather and his brother were drivers, and my great uncle was a pigeoneer, taking them to the front in baskets. So
yeah,
wonderful.
I think there was a picture
experience.
on that of that. Yeah, they again would have been taken from their loft, whether it been, even in the UK, they could have transported them in baskets, to Belgium, taken to the front, and they would fly back to London, or wherever it was. Uh, that particularly happened a lot in World War II with the French resistance. They were one of their best ways of communicating back to MI5. In actual fact, they used to run the pigeon service in World War II.
Fantastic. All right, well, we might wrap it up there. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar. I hope you've learnt something. I've certainly learnt lots of things and made a few notes to follow up on. So thank you so much. We host a number of events across the year, and you can find out more about those by visiting us at shrine.org.au. And you can subscribe to our e-newsletter if you're interested in any of those. So please join me in giving Nigel a virtual thank you, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.